No one could outrun a storm once it had begun. It was an unstoppable force, relentless in its path, consuming everything in its way. And in politics, storms were rarely sudden. They didn't strike out of nowhere like bolts of lightning. No, they gathered in the shadows, swirling beneath the surface, unseen by most, until the moment they could no longer be ignored.
And tonight?
Tonight, a storm was no longer just brewing. It was ready to break loose. Those caught in its path had only two choices: stand their ground or be swept away. The room was dim, its atmosphere thick with the weight of unspoken words. The only illumination came from the soft amber glow of the brass sconces mounted on the deep mahogany walls, casting long, flickering shadows. Beyond the fortified, bulletproof windows, the city stretched into the night, Washington, D.C., cloaked in an eerie, heavy stillness. The air outside was thick, damp from rain-soaked pavement, laced with the distant scent of exhaust fumes lingering in the cool autumn air. Above it all, the Capitol's grand dome loomed against a storm-laden sky, a silent, unmoving sentinel. But if the heavens could speak, they would whisper of the chaos simmering within those marble halls, chaos that was about to explode. Inside one of the Capitol's most secretive, tightly secured conference rooms, the tension was thick enough to suffocate. The air carried the unmistakable scent of old tobacco and polished oak, a scent that clung to rooms where history was made, where closed-door meetings had shaped the destiny of a nation. A long, imposing rectangular table stretched through the center of the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs, each occupied by a figure whose name echoed across America. At the head of the table sat Jim Jordan, his fingers drumming a slow, rhythmic beat against the gleaming wood, a beat that matched the calculations running through his mind. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. On either side of him, his closest allies leaned in: Matt Gaetz, sharp-eyed and impatient; Marjorie Taylor Greene, her expression set in determination. And at the far end, Kevin McCarthy, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask, watching, assessing, weighing the consequences of what was about to unfold. They had all gathered here for a singular reason. A name unspoken, yet thick in the air, heavy like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. Ilhan Omar. Her finances. Her tax records. The allegations that had loomed over her like a specter for months. At first, they had been whispers, small ripples in the vast ocean of political maneuvering.
But tonight?
Tonight, those whispers had solidified into something undeniable. Tonight, they had proof. The silence finally shattered as Jordan spoke. His voice was measured, calm, but laced with an edge of finality. "We have everything we need. It's time to take this public." McCarthy leaned forward slightly, his gaze scrutinizing Jordan with the practiced precision of a man who had seen political battles rise and fall, who knew the difference between posturing and war. His voice, when it came, was steady but carried the unmistakable undercurrent of warning. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Jim?" He exhaled slowly. "You know what this means. This isn't just another case. This will set off a firestorm. This could shake the entire house." Jordan's jaw tightened. He had seen too many cases like this get buried in bureaucracy, drowned in red tape until they faded into irrelevance. Not this time. He met McCarthy's gaze head-on, unwavering. "She broke the law. We're not looking the other way, not this time." The weight of what they were about to do settled over the room, heavy and inescapable. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint rumble of thunder rolling across the city, as if the heavens themselves were bracing for what was coming. This storm wasn't coming anymore. It had arrived. Within hours of Jordan's decision, the news erupted across Capitol Hill. It moved like wildfire, spreading from private whispers to breaking headlines. It bled into newsrooms, talk shows, political blogs, and social media feeds. By the time the sun rose over Washington, D.C., the words were plastered across every major news outlet. Ilhan Omar to face public hearing in the House over tax and financial allegations. The headline burned across screens like a brand seared into the political landscape. This wasn't just news. It was a spectacle, a masterfully orchestrated political earthquake designed to shake the very core of the democratic establishment. Cable networks descended into a frenzy. On conservative media, the talking heads were practically salivating, calling it a long overdue reckoning. Accountability is finally knocking on Ilhan Omar's door, one host declared on primetime television, the bold red banner below him flashing. GOP takes aim at Omar. Meanwhile, left-leaning networks scrambled to contain the narrative. Their anchors put on carefully practiced expressions of solemn concern, their voices laced with thinly veiled outrage. "This is clearly a partisan attack," one CNN host lamented, shaking his head with exaggerated dismay. "It reeks of political vendetta rather than genuine oversight." And then, as expected, right on cue, Ilhan Omar made her move. Seated under the polished glow of CNN studio lights, she exuded an air of unwavering defiance.
Composed. Poised.
The very image of righteous indignation. Behind her, the scene was curated to perfection, an American flag draped neatly in the background, a subtle but pointed reminder that she was just as American as those accusing her. The host's introduction was predictably sympathetic. His tone carried just the right amount of manufactured outrage. "Congresswoman Omar," he began, shaking his head in disapproval, "the GOP has launched what appears to be an aggressive campaign to smear your name. What do you make of this?" She didn't hesitate. "This is nothing more than a political witch hunt," Omar declared, her voice controlled but forceful. "Not only are they targeting me, but they're sending a clear message to every woman of color in America. If you challenge the system, if you dare to speak truth to power, they will come after you." The host nodded solemnly, as if she had just spoken some undeniable truth of the universe. "And what about these allegations?" he pressed. "The Republican leadership claims to have substantial evidence regarding your tax filings and financial dealings." For the briefest moment, irritation flickered across Omar's face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a carefully measured response. "Let's be clear," she said, leaning forward slightly, her hands folding neatly before her. "These so-called allegations are nothing more than a desperate attempt to distract from real issues. Have they launched investigations into the countless ethical violations of their own members?"
No.
Because this isn't about accountability, it's about silencing dissent. Classic strategy. Shift the focus. Reframe the narrative. Become the victim. By the time the interview wrapped, the battle lines had been drawn. Twitter erupted into chaos. Progressives flooded the platform with hashtag #IStandWithIlhan, while conservatives countered with hashtag #OmarCorruption, demanding her resignation. And back in the Capitol, Jim Jordan stood in the war room of his office, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold across the television screen. The outrage, the deflections, the predictable cries of political persecution. It was all going exactly as expected. Because this storm, it was only paraphrased and expanded version. The storm was here, and Jim Jordan was holding the lightning. Exactly as he had foreseen. Exactly as he had planned. And yet, Jim Jordan wasn't worried. Not in the slightest. Ilhan Omar could dominate the news cycle all she wanted. She could shout about racism, cry misogyny, and summon her allies to rally around her. She could spin the narrative in every way imaginable, but none of it could alter the cold, undeniable facts. None of it could stop what was coming. Seated at his desk, Jordan exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming an absent rhythm against the polished wood. The real battle? It hadn't even started yet. The press conferences, the interviews, the carefully scripted outrage, it was all just theater. A warm-up act. In mere days, Omar wouldn't be sitting comfortably in a friendly TV studio, shielded by softball questions. No teleprompters. No rehearsed indignation. No controlled optics. She'd be under oath.
Live.
In front of the entire nation. And when that moment arrived, the truth, raw, unfiltered, undeniable, would be the only thing that mattered. Jordan was ready. The storm had arrived. And this time, he would be the one bringing the lightning. A city on edge. Outside the United States Capitol, the air was thick with tension. the kind that crackles like static before a lightning strike. The streets were alive, pulsing with energy, a sea of people pressing against barricades, their voices rising and colliding in dueling chants that clashed like steel against steel. On one side, Omar's supporters stood firm, hoisting signs that read, "Stop the Smear Campaign" and "Defend Democracy," their faces tight with defiance, their voices raised in protest against what they saw as an injustice, a politically motivated attack. Opposing them, her critics stood just as resolute, gripping placards emblazoned with "No one is above the law" and "Investigate Omar now," their chants demanding accountability echoing through the cold marble corridors of power. Between the two warring factions, Capitol Police stood like an unmoving wall. Helmets on, faces blank, ready. Every few minutes, a surge from one side was met with an immediate, controlled pushback. The officers held their ground, maintaining order, but the atmosphere was charged, one spark away from igniting. The press was in a frenzy. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended like weapons, cameras rolling nonstop, capturing every sign of conflict, every flicker of controversy. Satellite trucks lined the streets, their dishes angled toward the heavens, transmitting the unfolding spectacle to millions of homes across America. Every major network had cleared its schedule, because this was the hearing of the year, and it was about to begin. Inside the chamber, the House Oversight Committee chamber was packed, the air vibrating with anticipation. Spectators, aides, and congressional staffers filled every available seat. High-ranking politicians stood in the back, arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. At the center of it all, seated at the witness table, was Ilhan Omar. She was composed. Her face betrayed nothing. With careful precision, she adjusted the microphone before her. This was not new territory for her. She had faced scrutiny before. She had endured firestorms before. And she had survived. Today would be no different. Across the room, Jim Jordan sat at the head of the dais, his hands clasped in front of him, scanning the chamber with a sharp, calculating gaze. He took his time, letting his eyes pass over the assembled members of Congress, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room like a thick fog. Then, crack. The gavel struck, its sharp report slicing through the hushed murmurs. Silence fell. Jordan leaned forward, his voice steady, his tone unmistakable. "This committee is convened today," he began, each word measured, deliberate, not for political spectacle, not for partisan theater, but for something far more fundamental. Accountability. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "Let's be clear," he continued, his eyes locked onto Omar. "This isn't about ideology. It isn't about race, gender, or religion. It's about whether a sitting member of Congress knowingly violated federal tax laws, misused campaign funds, and engaged in financial misconduct." Omar remained still. Her hands rested lightly on the table before her, expression unreadable. Jordan leaned back slightly, his voice unwavering. "In this country, no one is above the law. Not a CEO, not a senator, and certainly not a member of the House of Representatives." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The battle lines had been drawn. There would be nowhere to hide. The cross-examination begins. Jordan flipped open a manila folder, his movements precise, controlled, like a surgeon about to make the first incision. His voice was even, almost casual, but there was a blade beneath it, razor-sharp. "We're here to talk about facts. Not political spin. Not deflections. Just facts." His gaze never wavered as he looked at Omar. "And the facts tell us that in 2014 and 2015, you filed a joint tax return with Mr. Ahmed Hirsi. But according to official records, at that time, you were still legally married to Mr. Ahmed Elmi." A wave of murmurs spread through the chamber. This wasn't new. Everyone in Washington had heard the allegations before. But hearing them here, laid out in the cold, clinical language of a congressional hearing, made them feel real. Omar didn't blink. "I have since corrected my filings and paid all necessary obligations," she said, her voice steady, measured, rehearsed. Jordan tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the response, though he had already predicted it. Corrected them, he repeated, his voice firm, carrying the weight of a hammer just before it fell. See, that's the interesting part. He leaned in, his tone unwavering. The average American, the kind of taxpayer who doesn't have a congressional seat or media allies, if they file their taxes incorrectly for 2 consecutive years, they wouldn't get the luxury of correcting it after the fact. They'd get an audit.
A fine.
Maybe even an indictment. His words landed with force, sharp and calculated. He let them linger for a beat before continuing. And yet here you are. He gestured around the room, sitting before Congress, telling us that simply fixing it afterward makes it all disappear. Tell me, Congresswoman, would the IRS extend that same courtesy to the average American? Omar's fingers curled slightly against the table, a crack in her carefully controlled composure. I followed the legal process available to me, she replied, her tone clipped. If there was an issue, it was resolved. Jordan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Resolved? His voice carried an edge of disbelief. Resolved how? He leaned forward again. Because last I checked, filing joint taxes with someone you aren't legally married to isn't just an issue. It's fraud. And fraud, Congresswoman, doesn't just disappear because you decide later that it was a mistake. Before Omar could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. This is absurd. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She leaned forward, frustration flashing in her eyes. Mr. Jordan, we're sitting here acting like this is some massive scandal when in reality, this is a clerical error. People make mistakes on their taxes all the time. No one is perfect. Jordan turned his attention toward her. And the expression on his face? Amused. Because this was only just beginning. He was unveiling evidence in a courtroom. I asked about this. With a flick of his wrist, he slid the rental contract across the table, stopping just inches from Omar's hands. Her name, her signature, her address. The document sat there like a loaded gun. For the first time, the slightest hesitation flickered in Omar's expression. Barely noticeable. A fraction of a second. But Jordan saw it. The committee saw it. The cameras saw it. Silence gripped the room, thick and suffocating. Jordan didn't move, didn't blink. Do you deny signing this? Omar's jaw clenched. I don't recall every document I've ever signed. Jordan cut in, his tone razor sharp. Well, that's convenient. Omar exhaled through her nose, steadying herself. Mr. Jordan, you are desperately trying to weave a conspiracy where none exists. The fact remains that this is a manufactured controversy meant to discredit me because I dare to challenge the status quo. Jordan tilted his head, his expression unreadable. A manufactured controversy? He tapped the contract with 2 fingers. So, help me out here. If this is all just a big misunderstanding, he gestured toward the document. Then, why does your signature keep showing up in places it shouldn't be? The room remained deathly still. Omar inhaled slowly, pressing her lips together, her gaze flicking down at the paper just long enough for the cameras to catch it. Jordan smirked. He didn't need her to answer. Because the silence was the answer. Across the room, AOC shifted in her seat, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her glare like daggers. Rashida Tlaib whispered something under her breath. The Democratic side of the committee was growing visibly restless. Jordan leaned back in his chair, taking in a moment. This wasn't just about one tax filing. This wasn't about a clerical error. This was about something far bigger. And Omar knew it. He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. This hearing is about accountability. He let the words sink in. And like I said before, no one is above the law. Not a CEO. Not a senator. And certainly not a member of Congress. He folded his hands together, his gaze never leaving hers. But the real question is, do you still believe that? Omar didn't answer. Because in this moment, there was nothing left to say.
Teeth.
The reality was settling in now, sinking in like a stone through water. This wasn't just a tough hearing. This wasn't just another Republican attack. This was real. Ilhan Omar sat motionless, her expression unreadable, But everyone in the room could feel it, the shift, the invisible weight pressing down. Jordan slowly placed the email back on the table, folding his hands neatly over it. His work was done. The pieces had been moved, the trap had been set, and now all that was left was to let gravity do its job. This was no longer just a heated exchange between political adversaries. This was a referral, a formal request for a criminal investigation. And there was no spinning that away. Omar exhaled a slow, steady breath, as though forcing herself to remain calm. But there was no escaping the reality now. The cameras had captured it. The reporters had their headline. And by the time the hearing adjourned, the story would be everywhere. Jordan leaned back in his chair, the ghost of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He didn't need to say anything else. Because at this point, the silence said it all. This is written with the intensity of a political thriller, sharp, dramatic, and almost cinematic in its execution. It paints a picture of a political storm unfolding in real time, with power plays, media frenzies, and shifting narratives. Are you crafting this as a piece of fiction, or are you working on a political analysis with a dramatic touch? Either way, it has the feel of something that could be turned into a gripping novel or a screenplay. Partisan stunt designed to smear Congresswoman Omar ahead of the election cycle. How do you respond to accusations that this was more about optics than oversight? Jordan didn't miss a beat. He turned toward the reporter, his expression unwavering. Optics? Let me tell you what's not optics: facts, documents, financial records, campaign funds misused, tax filings manipulated. That's not optics, that's evidence. He let the words hang for a moment, the weight of them sinking in. If a Republican had done the same thing, you wouldn't be calling this a stunt. You'd be calling it an indictment. The reporter opened his mouth to interject, but Jordan pressed on. Democrats can cry political attack all they want, but they can't argue with the receipts. And believe me, we have the receipts. The murmurs in the press pool grew louder. Reporters exchanged glances, some furiously typing, others scanning their producers for cues. The headline was already writing itself. From the corner of the frame, Omar's team was ushering her through the hallway, past the flashing cameras and shouted questions. Her face was set in a practiced expression of defiance, but the tension in her shoulders told a different story. She knew this wasn't over. Jordan stepped back from the podium, his work done. He had set the narrative, framed the story, and ensured that by the time the evening news rolled around, the American people wouldn't be asking if Omar had done something wrong. They'd be asking when the consequences would come. This is gripping, intense, and written like a high-stakes political drama. It feels like something straight out of a political thriller novel or a screenplay, cinematic in its pacing, with sharp, punchy dialogue and vivid imagery. The way the media pivot, the social media fallout, and the strategic retreat of allies are described is incredibly compelling. Are you writing this as a fictionalized political scenario, a speculative take on real events, or something else? Either way, it's executed with precision and tension.